I think the vision might be yours. No one else might have had it. Your idea might be entirely new, and you own it. But it's really important to remember that you don't get there by yourself, and especially in today's world, right? The enfant terrible that Steve Jobs was is there's not a lot of room for that guy. Hey, I'm Scott Omelianuk, Scott O, the editor-in-chief of Inc. magazine and Inc.com. You're watching Behind the Brand with Bryan Elliot.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Behind the Brand. I'm here with the amazing Scott O from Inc. Scott, welcome to the show.
My pleasure, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
I usually ask my guests, how did you get this job?
That's a fair question. And for me, believe it or not, it was a job I absolutely did not want. I had been in media for 20 years, had the last brand I worked for, a really significant brand, sold it to private equity, and thought I had done enough of that and left. Went on to teach at university and a business school to try and be a consultant and a founder. And turned out that I was a really bad consultant, and I think we know, college professoring does not pay a lot of money, and I was not making any money, right? To be perfectly honest, I was a bad consultant because I picked businesses to work for that were interesting to me, not the ones that could pay me. So there's a lesson there for everybody. But what happened was I'd written a story for Inc.'s sister publication, Fast Company, about brand purpose. There was an opening here, and our CEO read the story, knew I had a media background, realized I'd been teaching entrepreneurship and other business classes, knew I was a founder, a failed founder too, just like a failed consultant, but thought, he thought that this was a great fit. And then for me, actually, the thing that changed my mind about returning to media was who the Inc. audience ends up being, right? And they're a remarkable group of people. They're really tribal, and as I'm sure you've heard from anyone you've talked to, when you have an audience that's a tribe of people, and there's a passion behind them, and you connect with them really well, that's special, right? You don't get that every day, so it makes the difference and makes the rest of your job so much easier. So ultimately, as soon as I found that out, I was like, gosh, this could be good.
Sign me up, yeah. There's a lot there that I want to unpack. You said a lot of things that were very intriguing to me that I want to find out more about, such as maybe this propensity or this being sort of magnetically pulled to help more than be focused on your own welfare, helping others versus helping yourself first. But let's go back in the chronology a little bit to young Scott. And let's talk about, what did you want to be when you grew up? Like, what was young, Scott thinking about, even before, maybe high school, college, even before that? What were you dreaming about?
Yeah, I had no idea, to be honest. I had, to be perfectly blunt, I had no dreams, really. And in college, I actually was a studio art major. And one day I had a professor, a very kind art history professor, come up to me and say, Scott, you do well when you write your papers. I think you're a better writer than you are a painter, and so maybe you just want to think about that. And some people are, think that was a terrible thing she said to me. I actually thought it was a gift because she was right, and I realized there was this facility I had with writing, and that sort of propelled me through a whole bunch of other majors, which I floundered at, but needed to sort of get out of school, right? So I ended up actually as a political science major because that was the least number of credits I needed at that point to get out. But I still didn't know that journalism was in my future. And in fact, I worked as a carpenter and as a garbage man in New York City's garment district for a year and a half before, on a whim, I went to graduate school in journalism. And that led to a job at GQ. And so for me, I can look back and there's a logic to my career, but at the time, in any given moment, it never really seemed like it. I was sort of floundering, but just floundered in the right way, I suppose.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so I guess it leads me to a question I ask often. I've asked everyone from Mark Cuban to Sarah Blakely to, you name it, all these sort of iconic, very visible entrepreneurs. But do you think entrepreneurs are born, or is it something that we can learn over time?
I think there's a quality that all entrepreneurs have, and I think it might be a little bit even moving toward a mental disorder almost, where you have to have such an indefatigable belief in yourself, where you have to understand that you are going to create the world that you inhabit and not not live in a world that's been created. And I don't think that's an easy thing to teach yourself. Maybe some really enlightened people can get there, but I think there's something innate about that, and I see it all the time. I was out to dinner with a founder just last night, and there is no gray in her world, right? She understands what her business is and what it will be and how she will profit from that and how her customers will benefit from that in the end, and don't even bring up any alternatives. There are no alternatives. So I think that part is innate.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did hear Mark talk about that. Like, if you have a plan B, if you have an exit strategy, you're not really an entrepreneur.
Right? I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I wonder. Jury's still out for me on that. We can talk about that a little bit more.
So here's the thing. One thing I'd say really quickly is that I think you can have a more normal career and then get to a place in your life, but it's often a forced place where suddenly the only alternative is entrepreneurship. And so your plan B and the plan A now are the same thing. And there are a lot of successful people that way, especially because they've had a prior career, right? They've had a corporate career or something like that.
I guess I can get on board with that, because I think the assumption that's built into that we're not talking about is that, I think Mark's alluding to this idea of completely quitting or giving up on your dreams, something that could be perceived as such. And most of us who are entrepreneurial, who've worked for other people, like myself, I worked at the studios. I was at Universal Pictures for all those years, collecting a salary, a good one, by the way, with full health benefits and all the
good stuff, yeah.
Yeah, good times, but opportunities come up. You see opportunities to jump, or if you want to use the buzzy word pivot, you can do that. But I think most of us are opportunistic, and we see an opportunity to go after something, and that's what we do.
Yeah, I will say that mentioning Mark Cuban reminds me of a time when I was at GQ, and we did an early profile on him before he was Mark Cuban, and before he was a millionaire, let alone a billionaire, right? And I remember only one line from that story, and I'm paraphrasing, so give me a moment, but the line basically was this introductory scene, and then it went, and then Mark Cuban lit a cigar, leaned back in the limousine, and took off on his way to becoming a millionaire. And so I think the writer was capturing something that Mark said, right? And that, to me, is that innate aspect of success, and ultimately for entrepreneurs, that part of that success. But you're right, the circumstances that come to us in life sometimes force situations, right? And even then, though, you have the opportunity to be successful or not, ultimately.
It sounds like you were born an artist. Is that accurate?
It's interesting. My grandfather was an illustrator for Walt Disney, and so it's not so far off. Like I think the art training that I had in school, whatever artistic nature there was in my family, actually helped me be a better writer when I got to GQ, right? I'm writing about style and fashion, so I had an understanding of all of that business. And I think that even translates today when I understand, as someone who looks at, say, pitch decks every day, or critiques a student's pitch deck, there's the measure of science that goes into it, the financials and all of those things, but then there's part of the art. Some of that's the marketing, some of it's the presentation, some of it's the logo, but it's the whole thing. I think I think really successful people understand that whole package. That's not to say I'm a really successful person, but I think you see that often as like having that full understanding, that global understanding that there's a certain expression of a brand, say, that is as much art as it is, the margin on the product you're selling, and that's what makes it successful.
Yeah, I'm sort of using my pseudo psychology brain to pull out a thread, which is going back to maybe something you said earlier that caught my attention, which is this, I don't know, gravitational pull, maybe in your career or just your nature. I think generally speaking, to make an overgeneralization, artists are not great at focusing on the money. They're really great at focusing on the art, at least in my experience. And so one of the things that, and I know this because I live with an artist. My wife is an artist, like dyed in the wool. She is like amazing. But she does not like talking about the money or thinking about money. She thinks about the art. And as a result, sometimes that can be difficult, especially when I see her work to be so amazing. She has a little furniture restoration business that she's grown out of the house from scratch. She'll find an old piece of furniture, either that someone's given away, or she'll buy it on Craigslist for $25, reimagine it, sand it, wax it, paint it, completely restore it, and flip it for like $800. And I'm like, you are brilliant. Like, this is amazing. And the profit margins are great too, but sometimes, a piece that I think should be more like $1,500, she'll say, oh, yeah, I'll let this go for $600. I'm like, honey, you need to earn what you're worth. So let's pull that apart a little bit more and talk about, maybe some recommendations or your advice to artists about how to earn what you're worth and how to sort of stand your ground. And let's maybe draw from your experience about, school and,
It's a really interesting thing, right? I will go on record saying that as a media executive, I have never not made the budget I was given. So I can handle someone else's finances. It's my own that I care less about for some reason. And that's ridiculous because, I live in New York. It's expensive here. I should be paying more attention to it, right? But I think probably your wife thinks this, and a lot of successful people that you've interviewed on Behind the Brand think is that you do the right thing and the money will follow, right? You do it the right way and with the right passion, and the money will follow. And so that's I think an important thing to keep in mind. And then there's this other piece of it, right? We talk about brand purpose a lot. I think people have purpose too, right? And if we actually step back and look at it, and you started to do that a little bit, inflicting pop psychology on the audience via my head. But I think when you finally find your purpose as an individual, lots of other considerations that used to be important weren't, right? And so in my own career, I can also look at how I've been a teacher, I've been a journalist, which is sort of teaching in its way. I have consulted to businesses. I advise businesses in the Inc. 5000 now when they come and ask me questions, right? So there is this thread through my career that's about education. And when I look back on it, I've always made that choice, knowing it or not, that I was going to tilt that way and not go to work on Wall Street. I was going to do this other thing. Lots of times that did brush up against the more artistic, but ultimately the through line for me was about helping other people become successful.
Yes, and I did ask that question with a bit of a strategy and context in mind because I've just had to learn this from having a certain amount of life experience now up to date. I wish if I could talk to, take me by the shoulders and talk to my, teenage self, I would have said, Bryan, please become more self-aware sooner versus later. And some of these things, like what we're talking about, is self-awareness of whether it's Shakespeare, know thyself, all these different things that we've heard for a long time. It's so valuable to know what we value, right? And so a mutual friend of ours, my mentor, Seth Godin, he continually reminds me when I ask him for advice, he goes back to the same answer, which is, Bryan, all you have to do is focus on basically two things. Ask yourself, what's it for and who it's for? And what it's for is really, he's talking about, what is the goal? And so for some of us, if you're on Wall Street, the goal is to maximize investor returns. Maybe that's your goal. That's a perfectly legitimate and, noteworthy goal. But if you're in education, maybe money is not your primary driver. You're not in it for the money. I can't think of any teachers who would say that, unless you're, teaching at Harvard or Wharton or something like that. But I would guess that most teachers are not in it for the dollars. They're in it to make a difference, to make an impact, and that's what lights them up, right? So as we're more self-aware about what lights us up, then I think we can make better decisions about what we do.
I think that's absolutely right. And, I recognize that as a professor of industry at a business school, right? Which means I'm not a tenure track professor. I'm teaching a couple of classes a semester, and essentially the dollar equivalent, if you really broke it down, was less than the minimum $15 minimum wage we talk about, right? It was not significant at all. And if that were the reason I was doing that, it would have been a really bad decision. But getting up in front of a classroom full of 40 students or 50 students, and starting to work with them and talk them through things around marketing or around a business idea that they have that they would like to see come to life, and having enough conversation with them to that one point where you sort of like see the light turn on behind their eyes and you've reached them, like that reward is astonishing. I honestly can't compare it to my biggest payday, and I've had good paydays in my career, right? But that is amazing, and so I think if you understand that that's important to you. Look, it doesn't pay the mortgage, right? You still have to find a way to pay the mortgage, but it's pretty good food for the soul.
Yeah, I think we're cut from that same cloth. It's one of the reasons I do this show. This show is just in me. It's something that I need to do. It needs to, I need to tell stories. I need to find out. But the origin of this show, it started very selfishly. I quit my big job in 2008. As you know, we've talked about this story off camera. But I was really desperate in 2008 after I left everything I had, the big salary, all the security, and I literally had to invent the solution to my problem. And I really thought, okay, now that I've made a commitment to start a production company, I've got lights, camera, action, I got the know-how, I'm literally going to start a show and ask people how to be successful, people who've been there and done that. And and I can tell you, even though this show is more profitable today than it was 10 years ago, it's still, I don't do it for the money. I do it because it lights me up so much. I'm so fulfilled. I'm so inspired. And I also love seeing other people's success. And so I guess if I'm imparting a little bit of advice right now to my people, I would say that that's a really healthy exercise to do, which is to sort of write down the things that you love to do that really make you feel fulfilled or make you happy. Instead of ROI, I think of it like ROJ, what's the return on joy? And you write those things down. Now, those may be congruent or incongruent with what you're good at. But as we write down the things that bring us joy, I think it really creates this roadmap that you can follow to make great career decisions. At least that's been my case.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the same is true. The sort of a collaborative exercise would be like looking at each step of your career and seeing where the commonalities were and where they weren't, and if they overlap with a joy, then that's like bonus time, right? But you'll find a path for yourself. I think I'm reminded of carpool karaoke. James Corden is interviewing Paul McCartney for it, and in the course of them driving around Liverpool, you get to see Paul make James Corden cry when he tells them a story and about how important the song was to James Corden. You see Paul at one point visit the barber shop from Penny Lane. You see him standing on a street corner at an empty bus station busking for money with his hat on the ground, right? And ultimately the last scene in the whole segment is lunchtime in a pub, and a curtain drops, and there's Paul McCartney behind the curtain with a band, and in this packed pub. And by the way, this packed pub is full of people, maybe a dozen of them were alive when Beatlemania was a thing, right? We're talking 50 years later, and he starts playing music, and everyone in the pub starts singing along, and you realize that Paul McCartney had no choice, right? He had no choice. He's playing a harmonica on a street corner in Liverpool. He's making someone cry in a car. He's entertaining a pub that was born decades after the music that he was singing made him famous. Like, he had no choice. Like, and if you can find even just a small piece of that in yourself, that's really a gift.
Scott, that story just gave me goosebumps. That resonates with me so hard. Like, that's the real deal.
I don't want to take anyone away from behind the brand, but if you have a few minutes and you look it up on YouTube, it's worth watching.
I mean, honestly, this show is all about going away from the main story and digging deeper into the origin story of others, because I just think there's so much to learn, and if that Jim Rohn quote is accurate at all, like, you are the sum total of the people that you hang around, both you and I at some point are going to be amazing because of all the people that we get exposure to.
Well, I think that, and I actually think this is the proof in what you're talking about, right? Is that I, as the editor-in-chief of Inc., I get to spend time with some really remarkable entrepreneurs who are doing astonishing things. And sometimes I'll get a phone call from them, and they'll tell me about an investment bank that's come to them and offered a valuation. Sometimes that money's hundreds of millions of dollars. And somehow, in all of that, I'm not at all jealous, right? There's a time when I would have thought, I'm a little venal. It's true. The money's not a bad thing, but I'm not jealous of these folks at all. The opportunity to watch them, there's some equivalent, right? For me, and I don't mean to suggest we're on the same levels at all, but whatever joy Paul McCartney was getting out of playing for those people, there's a similar feeling that I have when I see other people being successful. And being able to participate in their success, even in a sideways way, is really valuable.
Yeah, I relate with that too. And I think when you have that perspective that their win is not your loss, there's tremendous value in that and power in that. And also, I would think that when you're making an impact, when you're part of something that's big, at least this is how I feel too. I'm sure you're in the same position, but only like magnitudes more. You really realize, especially when I'm down into the comments of my videos, or I'm listening to feedback on the podcast, whatever. These are real people telling me that my video or my story changed their life or help them in their business. And if you think about, what powers America, right? And, this show and Inc., reaches out to the world. But if we just focus on the United States, like, that 80-20 rule is really in play, and it's probably more of a 95-5, which is 20% of the companies are responsible for 80% of the revenue in this country. But, like, look about, what about the 80% of these small business owners, these entrepreneurs, these freelancers, these people who have side businesses? Like, they're the backbone of this country. They're holding this thing up, with their bare fingers.
Yeah, and I would say, they carry an undue burden, even, right? So I was talking to a group of founders, successful founders, people who were in the Inc. 5000. And this was a few months ago when we were still sort of deeper in the pandemic. And somehow we came around to how difficult it was for all of them, how many sleepless nights they had trying to figure out how they were going to keep their teams employed, when they didn't know if there was revenue tomorrow or not, right? They wear that cloak, and it's heavy on them in a way that large companies with multiple layers, it's a lot easier for the CEO of a big company to say, we've got to get rid of 10% of the workforce. These smaller founders, they know who that 10% of their workforce is, and they know what their family situations are, and it becomes much harder, right? So I think you're absolutely right. They're the backbone. They are actually responsible for half of the economy. They're responsible for a lot of innovation. They do grow up into big companies, right? Sometimes, and it's not easy being them. So there's definitely a trade-off. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, right? Actually, after recently talking to Arianna Huffington, I leave my phone outside of my bedroom at night, but I will get texts from founders at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's because they can't sleep, and they can't sleep because they're worried about making payroll that week, or a big client, or something like that, right? Again, it's their own, it's a level of personal responsibility, I think, that larger companies don't inflict on their leadership, right? And I think it's to be admired that they embrace that.
Well, and that's why I love our partnership, and that's why I believe in it so much, because I think you guys are really fighting the good fight. I mean, you do feature big companies, the Mark Cubans of the world. Yeah, they're very visible, and they're doing just fine. But you're also writing and telling the stories and putting spotlight on people who are the up and comers, who are the next wave.
So here's the thing though too, Bryan, is that Mark Cuban, when you talk to him, will go out and take out the story that Inc. did on him 20 years ago, right? Before he was Mark Cuban. And he still cares about that and is proud of it. Damon John will tell you, every time I talk to him, no matter who I'm talking to him with, he'll take time to tell him how profoundly important the Inc. brand was to him when he was starting his own business, when he was starting FUBU. And so while we do cover these big people, they weren't always big, right? They've become friends of the brand. And to get back to something we talked about, having a tribe that has chiefs in it like that is pretty astonishing, right? And as you know, and you know this from your own experience, you know it from talking to Seth Godin and other marketers, when you have people who feel passionately about your brand and become advocates for it, and the way those folks are, it makes the job so much easier, so much more rewarding.
So let's talk about that. This show is called Behind the Brand. It's about brands and many other things, origin stories. How would you describe the Inc. magazine brand? And let me give you, preface that by saying what I believe a brand is not. A brand is not your logo, right? It's not your masthead. A brand is not, your marketing budget. But so how would you break down the Inc. magazine brand?
So I think, and then I want to tell you another story about a brand, and this has really clarified a lot of things for me. So try not to be long-winded, but for me, Inc. exists to support the American entrepreneur, and it's that simple, right? And that started out as a print magazine 40 some odd years ago, 43 years ago, that wrote stories about entrepreneurs, that provided advice that people could see and use to guide their own careers. Over time, that understanding of what support means has and will continue to change. To me, that's exciting. It's one of the reasons I'm here. So, at a certain point, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that meant adding a website to the Inc. brand. It meant creating the Inc. 500, out of which the Inc. 5000 grew, and lots of other recognition programs we do, because that recognition is so profoundly important to businesses, and the people we've talked about, struggling as they are, being recognized by Inc. can change the trajectory of their businesses. Right? Suddenly their teams get the recognition, they get the recognition, a banker sees it, investors come in. It can be a very different thing. Ultimately, we might do something very different altogether, but the through line of Inc. Is support for the American entrepreneur. And so as long as we don't lose sight of that, I think we're in a good place. And we do mean support, right? There are stories that we won't tell about the American entrepreneur because we don't see them as supportive in the same way. There's stories that might appear in Vanity Fair or on Dateline. We wouldn't tell those stories, right? They might be about businesses and business founders, but they're not us. We're about, talking to that sort of 50% of American business who's the SMB and the founder and the entrepreneur, and helping them get to the goal line.
So you've talked to a ton of really smart people. What are some of the highlights of things that you've learned, and who'd you learn it from?
I think one of the biggest things is what we started out talking about, right, is that you can create your own reality. It's hard, even for me, having seen it again and again, to accept that. I don't know that I'll ever do it, but seeing people have an idea, deciding that nothing is going to get in the way of that idea, and pursue it is amazing, and it's inspiring. I think other things I see, I think we overlook how much luck plays a part in a lot of business success. That does not mean that people still aren't working hard, but there are a lot of hardworking people who it doesn't click for. And that happens, and we see that too. But you can talk to those people, and the other lesson they'll offer you is that it's true, luck didn't happen this time, but I'm going to keep working hard because it will happen next time. I think paying attention to the brand and brand purpose is really significant, and I think we get very confused about what brand purpose is, right? Brand purpose is not corporate social responsibility. For us at Inc., as I said, it's about supporting the American entrepreneur. And I realized this when the previous media brand I ran, the one we sold to private equity, which was called This Old House Ventures, which is the parent company of This Old House, the public television show that's been on the air for nearly 45 years now, I think, magazines and websites, based on what you see when you watch that show. You're like, oh, this is about remodeling houses. It's about hammers and nails. It's about new siding or whatever it is, right? I sort of felt that wasn't the case, that there was something else there, and we did a bunch of research, and we realized This Old House, at least as far as its consumer is concerned, which is as tribal as Inc.'s is in its way, and what I recognized what was valuable to me and why I came to Inc., the fundamental reason This Old House has been as successful as it has is because it's not about remodeling. It's about creating a safe space for your family. Now, when you realize that, right, when you realize what your real brand purpose is, suddenly all these unnecessary things fall away. And all of these useful guardrails pop up, right? Suddenly we realize that, well, we just don't have to be about construction. We had a whole series of books that are similar to what your wife does, Bryan, right? It's called Salvage Style. And that was not what our contractor founders would have thought, but it's where our brand purpose let us go. And we knew what to say no to and what to accept and say yes to. And so I think that's incredibly valuable. And whether you do that as a person, as we talked about, right, finding your through line, or you do it with your business, that's really useful work because it can be so clarifying in the end. It can really help you succeed. Earlier this week, I talked to Hans Vestberg, the CEO of Verizon. He has 130,000 employees, right? And he's got engineers, and he's got retailers, and he's got guys on telephone poles and people creating, next-gen technology. Like, how do you bring all of those people together and talk to them coherently? And that's by working on trying to figure out what your brand purpose is. And he's done that, and it's about, building the networks that connect us and make us more efficient people. And his expression of that, by the way, is much better than mine just was. But the fact is, he's done it. And if you do it, I think it just makes you that much more prime for success.
Such good advice, especially because, when, I don't know, after you get through that startup mode and you're sort of, making money and you're doing well, there's this tendency to want to jump into different things. And remembering your brand purpose will really help you know how far or not, you can widen that lane. I think about Apple, for example. It's a super easy brand to point to. They could have just said, the naysayers or the stakeholders could have just said, we just need to stick to computers. We're a computer company. And, they had the vision there to say, our brand purpose is much more than just computers. We're saving people time, we're saving people money, we're connecting the world, and therefore, yes, it does make sense to make a MP3 player or a phone or all these other product extensions. And maybe that's part of the checklist you go through.
And ultimately too, it's about the ease with which they allowed people to access that stuff too, right? Johnny Ive has some really fascinating stories to tell about that. But I think that's absolutely right. When you realize that and you know where you are, it's really helpful when your business is suddenly troubled too by a changing consumer behavior or new technology, right? You used Apple. I'll use another obvious example, but it's Kodak, right? So think about this. You have a company. Your company has a brand purpose. Your company can be in different businesses, and in fact, over time, will have to be, right? So with Kodak, it was a company that was involved in picture taking, right? But it was about paper and chemicals and transferring a picture. They invented the digital sensor, right? That is in every camera. And they put it on the shelf because they thought they were in paper and chemicals and printing pictures. Their advertising knew better. The executives didn't, right? What they were, why they were important to the consumer was they allowed them, consumers to help capture memories. Yeah. Didn't matter to the consumer how that memory was captured. Consumers didn't give a damn about the chemicals and the paper and stuff like that, right? They cared about the memory itself. So when other people picked up this sensor and Kodak didn't, their whole world shifted. If they had understood they were in the business of memory capture and helping people to understand, their past and have that moment of nostalgia or whatever it is, they would have been more easily able to see their future and know where to step into a new line of business as a company. They were taking the company and the brand purpose and moved it to a new business and still be the Kodak we once knew. But that didn't happen.
I love that lesson. Know what business you're in. So good. So good. I can go on with, you're triggering all these memories. You ever see that movie, The Founder, with Michael Keaton? And he is the founder of McDonald's. It's on Netflix now. It's a terrific movie, but he has there's that moment, there's a scene when he's in the office with his accountant / lawyer, and he's thinking about burgers and production lines and being more efficient, and his accountant, his lawyer confidant, says to him, "You don't know what business you're in, buddy. You're not in the burger business. You're actually in the real estate business, because all of the things that McDonald's did to grow." So anyway, you're causing my mind to really go into really cool places. So thank you for that advice. Let's go to the flip side of that now, which is, what's some of the worst advice, Scott, you've heard that maybe you took or didn't take? Let's go down that path for a little bit.
So I'm not going to say, it's hard to go into business with family. We see that all the time. So someone tells you that's the wrong thing to do. I rather than say what the worst advice is, I think focusing on some of the things that we don't, that maybe we take for granted, is a more interesting place to look, right? So I would say that I think businesses are generally more successful when there is a front person, I should say, right? Someone in front of the microphone, and the technologist or the person who understands the back office or whatever it is. It's really hard for people to have a coherent understanding of the entire universe of a business, especially when it gets complicated or if it's a certain size, right? And so we can all look at, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. One of them has always been a front person, and one of them has been sort of the person who understands the technology better, to just talk about technology businesses right now. Those partnerships are incredibly rare and incredibly valuable, and they make a profound difference. And I think there are a lot of businesses that have failed because of those partnerships, right? And so I think finding the right co-founder is something we don't pay nearly enough attention to, and is really like magic in a bottle, where you both understand your swim lanes, where you're both really competent at what you do, where you're not jealous of each other, and you have a clarity of vision that doesn't put you in competition constantly for every decision. That's pretty rare and magical when you get it. Startup that I helped create, I was a co-founder of, created the patent for. My co-founder and I couldn't get along. It was a wellness business, right? It would be doing very well right now, but we just couldn't see eye to eye, and it's because we both were sort of on the same side of the business.
Two sheriffs.
Yeah, exactly. Two sheriffs, and it was a terrible thing, as I think about it.
Yeah, that's a super good point. Let me ask this too. So, from the perspective of a major media company, Inc., what's something that you believed, maybe you can go back however long you need to, 5 or 10 years, or maybe even just 5 years. I'm curious, what's something that like a deeply held belief that you thought just a few years ago that you no longer believe? What's changing?
So that's a really interesting question, and it might have to do with the fact that I said I never had any dreams necessarily before, right? Is that I've never been particularly sentimental about the media business, and I think it's actually allowed me to not have those beliefs, which I think ultimately are limiting, and to see lots of advantage. So really quick, and to fill in a little bit on my career, the first job I had at GQ was as a fact checker, lowest of the low, mailroom equivalent of the agency world or whatever. I got an opportunity to write, but the writing I had to do was fashion copy. It wasn't big cover stories. It was nothing sexy. It was the magazine's fashion copy. That fashion copy actually paid the bills, right? So I got to see inside the workings of the business. Found it pretty interesting. When the internet arrived, I realized my own consumption habits were changing. I wasn't spending so much time on print and paper. I was spending more time digitally. So I I created the original web presence of Esquire magazine. And then same thing, I sort of floated off into the world of television and became an on-camera person and then a producer, and all of that. And with the fact that I ultimately, way back in the day, was a carpenter, is how I landed at This Old House, right? Having that multi-platform experience and then actually being a carpenter got me to This Old House. And there, I just felt like, and I worked at a company that was a magazine company. It was part of Time Warner. It was Time Inc., right? World's largest magazine publisher. But more and more, I saw that there was opportunity for us as brands beyond the print magazine. And I had a CEO, I had 6 CEOs in the time I was there before the company ultimately disappeared, who said, we don't know anything about e-commerce. We're a magazine company. We don't know anything about television. We're a magazine company. And the only thing I was thinking was we're a content company with a really passionate audience. And if that content is e-commerce, or if that content is television, or if it's some other digital opportunity, if it's video games, I pitched a video game business at Time Inc. With a really significant Asian video game producer that they said no to. That significant Asian video game producer went to someone else with, made $75 million in its first year in the market, right? If Time Inc. had been able to see past it, much like Kodak, as we talked about before, right? It could have been an entirely different story. So I would say I don't actually try to have those kinds of beliefs, Bryan, because I think they're pretty limiting. I can't predict what technology is coming. I can't predict how consumer behavior is going to change. In the short term, certainly, we can and we do. But beyond that 5-year horizon, it's not possible. And so I think to remember your brand purpose and who you're serving are the only things that you really have to hold sacrosanct. And then how you do it, in the partnerships you do it with, all of those things are up for grabs.
Again, really good advice, and it's so healthy and refreshing to hear that, because, again, I asked it thinking, here's Inc. with a 40-plus year legacy. It's a legacy brand, let's face it. Some of the things that we get stuck saying when we're in legacy brands are things like, well, we've always done it this way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, that kind of stuff. And that ends up, you end up being Kodak or Blockbuster Video.
That's right, because someone is always fixing it, right? It might not be you, it's going to be someone else, and you're going to be sorry they did and you didn't.
I could probably talk to you for 6 more hours. Let's
And we will, just not here with everyone else, right?
let's round third and bring it home. And let's give some parting words to new founders, people who maybe just have this little germ of an idea that's beginning, and give them your best advice about how to be successful. We all want the same thing. Success by definition might be many things. We've already talked about the ROJ and money and whatnot, but with those assumptions aside, give me some of your best advice to make that dream happen.
I think the vision might be yours. No one else might have had it. Your idea might be entirely new, and you own it. But it's really important to remember that you don't get there by yourself. And you get there, whether that's the team that you hire and put together, whether it's how you engage with your customer, your vendors, all of those folks, and how you think about your relationships in totality really make the difference, and especially in today's world, right? The enfant terrible that Steve Jobs was there's not a lot of room for that guy anymore. It's really important to realize that, and this is both for 2 reasons. I would say this: one, you'll ultimately have better success by asking other people to help you along the way. And you'll also be able to shed some of those burdens we talked about earlier, where you're not the only one pulling the cart, right? If you can accept that, still maintain your vision and be as passionate about it as you always have been, incredibly important. But acknowledge that there's room to learn, that there are other people to help you get there, and that by asking, you can achieve so much more. You will achieve so much more.
I mean, we were just sitting back, chopping it up, reminiscing about the good old days and all that. Tracking my roots, where I came from and where I'm going. But like I say, man.